many thanks for the invitation, first of all. It's a pleasure to be back, unfortunately, only virtually to Trier for this annual conference on European state aid law. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come physically to Trier, maybe in another occasion. But I see that DigiComp is well represented by Karl Sukup, and you have a quite lively debate with him and with other participants. So today you asked me to talk about the Commission Climate, Energy and Environmental Aid guidelines. I'm going to focus a bit on the application of these guidelines, in particular as far as the two most relevant sections where we have developed quite an experience. I would not go through the set of rules because I think these are quite familiar to you, but just a couple of snapshots about the main areas. And I will eventually conclude by raising some potential issues or challenges that we are discussing in the context of the continuous application of the guidelines in the context of the present, delicate economic and geopolitical situation. So with that, let me move to my first slide. I wanted to put this slide at the very beginning because it gives you a bit of perspective of how the application of the state aid guidelines has been influenced by quite a heavy and relevant developments both in the economy and in the policy side. The guidelines entered into force at the beginning of 2022, and then we went through the COVID pandemics. First, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis, and eventually the Inflation Reduction Act and the geopolitical tensions that have been at the forefront of the Commission initiatives. And if the guidelines at the very start are very much geared towards the implementation of the European Green Deal, which is the flagship project of this Commission, it has also been influenced in its application by the following events that led also to steer the policy of the Commission initiatives in a way that made possible to accelerate the deployment of renewables and decarbonization in a way to get more independent from the energy sources that were coming from other countries, in particular Russia, but also the components of the energy transition
Bonjour,
that come from
beaucoup.
abroad, on which we are very, very much dependent. So state aid control has been influenced, and as you learned today from Karl, it has been the guidelines have been coupled with a number of other instruments that have certainly had an impact on its application. The temporary framework, then becoming a temporary crisis framework, and then a temporary crisis and transition framework. I think earlier on, Stephanie was even wondering whether the temporary crisis and transition framework is not today attracting some of the projects that would normally fit into the state aid guidelines for climate, environmental protection of energy. But I will get to that in a while. So let me give you a bit of a snapshot about the main results of the application of the CEEAG and the main sections that I want to highlight to you today. First of all, just a very brief reminder of the history of the acronym, why do we call them CEEAG? The CEEAG stands for, as you know, from Climate, Energy and Environmental Aid Guidelines, and followed the implementation or the adoption of previous guidelines that were called EAG or EAG with just one E or two E's. As you can see from my first bullet, there has been an evolution of the enforcement of static control in this area over the last decades, that started with environmental measures and extended to energy measures, and now they are fully encompassing climate protection measures at large. So the scope of the guidelines in general and the scope of the policies that member states are implemented with the state support in this area is increasing, and this is why this type of guidelines, this sort of guidelines, are becoming quite important in the context of our European and national economic policies. The CEEAG provide the member states with a new framework which builds on the experience that we had provided before through the EAG, but is updated to match to the new economic reality. The new technological developments are much more flexible than they used to be before, are in a sense future-proof because they are more principle-based compared to the previous rules, and therefore they are in a sense quite ready to be adapted to the developments that we may see in the technological area or in the economic area related to energy and environmental and climate protection. As I said before, these guidelines are very much geared towards making possible for member states to support the European Green Deal objectives. And how they do that? They try to do that by trying to achieve a right balance between different needs, which are indeed the legitimate call of several member states to sustain the energy transition, and therefore the guidelines have a much broader scope than they used to have. They increase the flexibility and streamline the rules that were in place before, and try at the same time to make sure that that aid, when it is used, is directed to what is necessary, does not crowd out private investments, does not lead to greenwashing or favors incumbent. We need also to make sure that aid is calibrated and does not exceed what is necessary for the project. Is a classical test of proportionality of the aid, and that the competition distortions are minimized. We try to do that, for example, by incentivizing as much as possible the use of competitive award processes, tenders, auctions, that guarantee that competition distortions are minimized, and we try to do it by also pushing member states to consult in advance on the largest plan that they want to introduce, because this public consultation allows to take into account stakeholder views, and in the design of the measure to make sure that competition distortions are duly taken into consideration, at least at the national level, and minimized so that the measure can be assessed in a lighter form. Eventually, there is the classical cost effectiveness aspect of the static control that you see in many different guidelines. Another important element, I think, of the CEEAG is that the coherence of these guidelines with the sectoral EU legislation has been duly reinforced. it is clear that state aid control goes hand in hand with relevant energy and environmental rules, and in particular, it has become really a feature of our assessment that state aid cannot be approved unless it complies with the linked provisions of the EU legislation and regulations. So that's a quite important element that you will find also in some decisions that I'm going to present to you in a short while. The guidelines have a number of different sections, quite large number of sections, up to 13. Today, I'm going to talk to you about basically two sections. Section 4.1 that covers decarbonization at large, both energy sector and industrial decarbonization. I would focus more on the energy part, though. And I would talk to you about security of supply, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the entire framework of the different sections because it covers quite a large set of different measures that member states may deploy to facilitate the energy transition and ensure environmental protection and climate protection. Those sections follow more or less a set of common assessment principles. And of course, for every specific area, these common assessment principles may have slightly different requirements, but the overall logic remains the same. And as you can expect, the common assessment principle starts with the identification of the positive contribution of the measure to the development of economic activity as per the 1073C of the TFU test, which the Court of Justice recalled very well, has to be structured in a certain way. And I'm referring in particular to the Hinkley Point judgment here. So looking at the rationale of the measure, at the scope of the supported activity and the incentive effect of the measure. And then, as you know, the assessment needs to take into account the impact of the aid on competition and trade under the treaty, and therefore the guidelines develop rules about necessity, appropriateness, eligibility, public consultation, as I said before, and proportionality. And eventually you have a session dedicated to avoidance of undue negative effects on competition and trade between member states. And eventually we do a balancing test, the classical balancing test that assesses to what extent the aid is compatible with the treaty. Two important provisions taken on board from the previous guidelines and still very valid are the evaluation of large schemes and the transparency of aid that should be, found their way in a public register available to people. So that's the main features of the guidelines. Now, I wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of where we stand in terms of aid amounts and projects approved. So far, for the entire set of the guidelines, we have seen about 40 something measures, but of course there are more measures in the pipeline. And we have approved aid up to basically 90 billion of aid under the guidelines. In this slide, I'm just focusing on the measures that are most relevant for energy generation, and that these are the measures that come under section 4.1 and section 4.8 of the guidelines. As you can see, the number of decisions is more limited. Here we're talking about 17 decisions. Of course, some member states have multiple schemes in place. For example, as you can see, Germany has more than one scheme in place. When it comes to energy generation, the amount of the state aid which has been approved reaches almost 80 billion. So it's the largest majority of the total budget allowed under the CEEAG. And it is an amount that, of course, is not just of 1 year, but it extends for the entire duration of the schemes which have been approved. So it is an amount that you have to consider being deployed by member states over a certain number of years. There are quite a large variety of schemes. There are schemes that cover the entire territory of the member states, schemes more limited in geographical scope. There are schemes that are dedicated to several technologies, others which are more specific for innovative technologies like hydrogen, or specific technologies like offshore wind. As you can see from the graph on the right side, we have approved quite a significant amount of aid for countries like Germany and the Netherlands. And the main reason for that is that Germany and the Netherlands have presented to the Commission quite large, comprehensive plans for decarbonization. You all know about the German EEG measure that is really comprehensive in terms of scope, and therefore he is particularly large in terms of budget, while other member states typically maybe design more dedicated schemes. The same goes for the Netherlands, which have the so-called SDE++ scheme, which is quite large and covers all possible technologies in a multi-technology type of competitive process. So as I said, section 4.1 and section 4.8 are the main sections in terms of application. Let me just recall that section 4.1 allows for the support of measures that promote renewables, energy from renewable sources, and it extends to all possible measures that contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Here, whenever there is a target set or enshrined in the European legislation, the necessity of the measure is basically accepted without any further justification. For other type of technologies, there is more an assessment or a justification needed in terms of need. The competitive bidding is classical, it's a default approach for technologies contributing to decarbonization, but it is also possible to have exceptions from this requirement when it is justified. And this might be the case, for example, when the potential supply is insufficient, when the beneficiaries are relatively small, or, for example, when you have an individual project selected to participate in a large integrated cross-border project applying innovative R&D and I technologies. These are these projects that typically also come into an assessment under the IPCI framework. It's also a feature that a more limited eligibility can be approved on the basis of new and more flexible grounds. For example, when there is a difference of more than 10% in the bid level, then we typically accept that there are separate tenders or separate categories of technologies that can be put in separately in competition. What is the case experience? I wanted to bring to you a couple of cases which I think are quite relevant. The first one is the German EEG, which I mentioned before. As I said, is a very large scheme, a comprehensive scheme that frames the energy policy of Germany across its territory and across a number of years. So it's not surprising to see that this is a very large scheme, which has very ambitious objectives in terms of production of renewables electricity. Our assessment here has been particularly focused on the making sure that the tenders for the allocation of aid were well designed and that they ensured competitiveness between the different participants. We also agreed with the German authorities that there was scope for separate regional measures to assess temporarily grid congestion issues. And we also have an agreement on the phase out of support for renewable electricity production at times of negative price. So these were the typical issues that we have been discussing with the German authorities, leading to a positive conclusion of this assessment and eventually a compatibility decision. Another interesting case here is the Romanian hydrogen scheme. It is an interesting scheme because it's the first one that we have approved under the CEEAG as dedicated to hydrogen. It is a scheme also made available throughout the Recovery and Resilience Facility that makes possible for member states to use additional funds to support the renewables and the moving away from gas and other fossil fuels. In this case, it's renewable hydrogen through electrolysis for the purpose of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The scheme aims at achieving by the end of 2025 capacity production of 100 megawatts and at least 10,000 tons of hydrogen per year. The aid is granted in the form of direct grant, and the maximum amount of aid that can be granted by project will not exceed 50 million. As in the previous case, the eligible projects will be selected throughout a transparent and non-discriminatory bidding procedure, and the beneficiary will compete for the lowest amount of aid per megawatt of installed electrolysis capacity. And also in this case, we declare this scheme compatible. Let me now move to section 4.8. This is a section related to security of supply. Under this section, we typically review measures which are called capacity mechanisms, which are measures by which the member state support the to support the capacity, energy generation capacity, with a view to ensuring that in case of stress of the system, the system can resist and can provide the necessary amount of generation. These measures often covers the missing money type of issue that emerges in the energy market, leading due to the presence of insufficient incentive to invest in the longer term. A feature of this section is that is very much linked with the EU electricity regulation. And therefore, the process that leads to the assessment of these measures has to comply with a number of requirements that stem from the electricity regulation first, and then from the state aid guidelines. But let me say that in reality, the state guidelines here take over the main requirements of the electricity regulation and basically make sure that these requirements of the electricity regulation are indeed met. So once these requirements are met, most of the state aid compliance issues are also solved. We are talking about technologically neutral schemes based on adequacy assessment. We are talking about schemes that should be open to cross-border participation and on which the cost should normally be borne by the electricity consumers. Let me give you an example of an important decision that we have adopted under the guidelines. Recently, we have approved the Belgian capacity remuneration mechanism. I should say that we have approved under the guidelines technically an amendment of the previous decision that was adopted even before the CEEAG came into force. But in reality, also the previous decision under the Belgian capacity remuneration mechanism followed basically the same set of rules that were eventually implemented and enshrined in the guidelines. So if you have to look at this case as a whole and at the conditions that we have applied in this case as reflecting the requirements under the electricity regulation and the new guidelines. So here the test is about making sure that when the state decides to procure capacity and generation capacity, it does it on the basis of an adequacy assessment, and that should be well justified, that shows that there is a gap and that therefore it is justified to go and ask participants to make themselves available against a remuneration. Another feature of this scheme is that introduces quite strict CO2 emission limits, and therefore it is the case that the guidelines make possible for member states to design a capacity remuneration mechanism that are quite green, or at least as green as possible. Typically under capacity mechanism, you try to procure different type of technologies and generation, including demand response, that can contribute to the adequacy gap, but eventually also gas plants typically find their way under this mechanism because of the need to be available when it is necessary. But in general, a wide comprehensive auction putting together the different technologies make possible to reveal how security of supply can be ensured by either existing plants or new plants or batteries or demand response. The latest auction run by the Belgian authorities a few weeks ago shows in particular that the largest majority of the adequacy gap that will be identified in few years time actually is going to be covered by batteries. So the scheme will make possible for these batteries to find a way to invest and to find a remuneration for their investments. So that's the Belgian capacity mechanism. And with that, I wanted to now describe to you some challenges, some issues that we are discussing in the context of the implementation of the guidelines. As you can imagine, and as it was portrayed in my very first slide today, the implementation of the guidelines is influenced by the evolution of the economic and geopolitical environment, and therefore there are issues which are relevant for the application of the guidelines. In principle, the main goals that the guidelines achieve or want to achieve remain the same. There are the environmental protection and decarbonization, security of supply, and affordability. These are the three classical objectives that underpin not just the guidelines, but also the entire EU energy policy, and since a good while. What has emerged is that these different goals also show some trade-offs, because the crisis has made clear that it's not always so simple or so straightforward to achieve the same and all these goals in the same way and that same rhythm without any possible trade-off. And the challenges that here we have is that indeed the energy crisis has made, at least for a temporary period, clear that the cost of decarbonization and electrification is particularly large. Global competitiveness issues have raised concern in terms of ability of Europe to sustain a productive value chain in the renewables industries. The increased financial cost of the energy transition, which is typically a macroeconomic issue, stemming from the fact that rightly so, central banks have been fighting inflations and had to increase interest rates. But this is how, of course, has led to an impact on the financing of renewables projects, in particular in consideration of the fact that most of these renewables projects have a very large capital expenditures at the very beginning of the investments period, and then they deliver a return on these investments only gradually and only over time. You have it in all technologies. Of course, it's much more evident in technologies like nuclear, but also on offshore wind and in other hydrogen, for example. The investments might be quite relevant at the start, and the benefit that you get in terms of reducing operating cost only emerges with time. And finally, there is an issue of strategic autonomy that has been at the forefront of the debate, as you have heard also today. Dependence on gas from only one country, basically, or mainly from one country like Russia, or dependency from China for many different components of our renewables value chain, raise concern in terms of the ability of Europe of achieving our targets. The response of the EU to this to the crisis, in particular, the short-term response to the energy crisis, you learned it this morning, has seen a number of different instruments being deployed, including the temporary crisis and then transition framework, a redirection of funds from the European budget to achieve the 2030 and 2050 targets, and some emergency interventions to mitigate the impact of energy prices or to favor the provisions or the security of gas, and measures to reduce the consumption of gas and electricity. In the longer term, the Europe has also put forward a number of relevant reforms. Here, what I think is most relevant for the stated control, and in particular for the application of our guidelines, is the reform of the electricity market design, which has reached a general agreement or general approach just a few weeks ago, after quite a long debate. And this electricity market design sets a bit the main framework that member states should follow when they want to sponsor the development of energy generation, in particular decarbonization sources, in particular the electricity market design calls for member states to use a two-way contract for difference, which is an instrument that on one hand guarantees a minimum remuneration to the energy generator, on the other hand makes possible for the state to recoup any excess profits that the electricity or the energy generation producer may found in case the market leads to such an excess of profits. The electricity market design also promotes long-term bilateral contracts between producers and consumers, the so-called power purchase and sale agreements, or PPAs, and calls for the introduction of measures for flexibility in the electricity system to cater for the increasing role of renewables that not always provide electricity at the request of the system, in particular when it is night and when the wind doesn't blow. There might be indeed a need to complement the renewables fleet of generators with other forms of flexibility, including demand side management and storage. As I said, the strategic autonomy and the competitiveness issue have been quite in front of the political agenda. And today you heard about the European Critical Raw Material Acts and the Net Zero Industry Acts, which are currently debated by the co-legislature. The strategic technology European platform is also quite relevant in the sense that try to focus the efforts of member states towards the technologies that are relevant for the energy transition. Last week or a couple of weeks ago, the Commission also presented the European Wind Power Action Plan, and this will certainly have relevance when it comes to the assessment of renewable schemes, in particular when it comes to offshore wind projects. The impact of the US IRA is quite unclear, as you heard from Carla today, but it's certainly one of the aspects that remains high on the agenda, and this is why in the TCTF you have a specific temporary provisions. This is not something that at this stage enters into the equation of the CEEAG. And finally, of course, the assessment of the projects under the guidelines we need to take into account of the revised Renewables Energy Directive. Let me conclude. The CEEAG and the sections in particular that I described to you today aim at providing the member states with an updated, flexible, and future-proof framework for coordinated state aid support to reach the Green Deal objectives. The CEEAG implementation is picking up. We have indeed some cases that would have typically gone under the CEEAG, which today go under the TCTF, to the extent that TCTF makes possible to accelerate and simplify the assessment of straightforward schemes. But of course, the TCTF also comes with some other strings attached. For example, under the TCTF, you can only assess schemes, you can only assess measures designed as a two-ways contract for difference. So whenever these measures do not fit into the TCTF, the CEEAG remains a relevant part of the assessment, in particular for measures for decarbonization that would typically fall under Section 4.1. The CEEAG has weathered the energy crisis and has been used during the energy crisis, as I have shown, has been complemented by temporary instruments to cater for the crisis and accelerate the energy transition, but remains the main instrument to assess measures for energy and environmental protection and climate protection over the long term. And talking about the long term, the reform of the electricity market design and the other European initiatives that aim at strengthening the European strategic autonomy and global competitiveness go hand in hand with the stated control framework, which has as a main goal the preservation of a level playing field in the internal market and promoting growth on the basis of merits. And this is the contribution that stated control framework intends to bring about in these discussions when these European initiatives are promoted and put into force. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. So I thank you very much for your attention.